But up until the late 80s, almost every gospel project I did tended to be one day and very tightly budgeted. And then there came Donald Lawrence. Donald grew up in Gastonia, and he went to, I think, Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, I think is where he went. And the first time I saw him was he was kind of a second string singer for the PTL folks. The PTL was a kind of a button-down outfit. You know, people wore sport coats and shirts and little ties and all this business, and Donald wasn't having it. He was wearing some fairly extreme styles. he had a hat that we all liked a lot, which was it was just a hat with a bill on it, but the bill went straight up and it said "boy" on there, so some fashion thing, whatever. And plus, he was clearly, you know, up to the best of any of the singers there. Anyway, he did that for a while, but it was just not his scene. And he picked up a job as music director for Stephanie Mills. We didn't know at the time. We thought, you know, good gig, you know, but he really had a plan. His plan was that since gospel was this sort of low budget slapdash kind of production, he wanted to get out where the big stuff was happening, R&B in particular, and learn about it, learn about touring, learn about you know, major label production, and learn about how to make a really first class record, and bring that back to gospel. So while he was doing that, John Key had moved to the area and was starting to build up his trip, but he was hustling them out pretty quick in those early days, records I mean. And anyway, so Donald started bringing some of the Stephanie Mills work back to Reflection, mostly vocals and some things. And we were rigging up, we had two 24-track tape machines synchronized and doing all his business, and did a gospel record for Stephanie. We did the backup group, old backup singing group with that organization, were old buddies of Donald's from Gastonia. So we made a record of them that was actually like, the production quality was up to anything I was doing in other records, label projects. It was heading to Capitol, and unfortunately, as happens in record labels, their budgeting and management changed before the record came out, and it didn't do anything. But the next record we did was Songwriter's Point of View, which was started out to be a Donald Lawrence record, but he involved the Tri-City Singers, and so it sort of became a Donald and Tri-City record. And I think this was, I don't know, 90-ish, 91 maybe, and it was radical. I mean, I really like doing projects that sort of cut new ground, and this one cut a lot of new ground. I mean, the choir rapped at one point. Stephanie Mills was on there. Peebo Bryson was on there. These are R&B artists, and we had beats running in the background, and just a lot of kind of radical stuff. And when it came out on the new Gospel-centric label, I think it was maybe, the DJs were afraid of it. And they got a lot of pushback from radio, going, "Whoa, what is this?" But it became popular by the fans, basically making radio get it on there. So it started to really create some waves. Meanwhile, Kevin Bond had moved to Charlotte and joined Donald's sort of production camp, and he'd moved in from the West Coast, and he was a Chicago guy like me. So Bond and Donald and I sort of became the fixing and mixing team for Vicky Mack at Gospel-centric, and we were kind of fixing and finishing a lot of records. At one point, I think 2/3 of the records they had out were ones that we had worked on, and budgets were still really tight compared to major labels, but at least it wasn't like bashing it in a day. They'd send in multi-track tapes. And it'd be like, "Okay, Mark, you got 3 days, but it better be good," you know. But anyway, among the various artists we got in, we got this these tapes in from a young Texas artist, and they used a really good truck down there to make the live recordings. So the basic live tracks sounded great. But not really knowing any better and being a guy who was just overflowing with ideas, this was Kirk Franklin, and before he had a record out. He took these tapes into the studio and started, singing new backup vocal parts that he'd thought of, not stopping to think that all the old parts were all over the audience and the drums and everything else in there. So it was pretty much a mess. And anyways, that one came in, and I mixed it in the 3 days that they gave me to mix it. This was the Kirk Franklin and Family record, and I spent most of my time doing what we call chasing ghosts on a live record. If somebody, changes a part, then the old part may still sort of float around the background somewhere, and you got to try and figure out where in the world it is and get rid of it if you can. So anyway, so it went out, and I thought, and I was able to call some hits. I mean, John Key and sometimes Donald, I could hear a song, say, that's going to hit it. But I totally missed this Kirk record. It just seemed like a little old church record, and I didn't think much about it. And then 6 months later, somebody said, "Yeah, you remember that record, Kirk Franklin?" I said, "I think so." And he said, "What's on the chart?" And I said, "Oh, great," because there was the gospel chart in those days only came out every 2 weeks, and almost never had a gold record on it. And so it was on there, and I said, "It's really climbing." And I said, "Well, that's cool," and had not used to seeing that. So next thing we know, it not only was getting near the top of the chart, but it crossed over to R&B, and I'm thinking, there's no R&B on this record. How did that happen? So it's a very churchy kind of record, and then it went gold. It's like, what? And so everybody was just amazed, and then it went platinum. So this was like, fireworks are going off, and nobody had any idea. And this little label on the West Coast, Vicky Mac's label, was suddenly important. And there was another thing that had been happening at the same time. At that time, there were big box stores. There's still a few, but there was like Zayre's and all these names you don't hear anymore. A big box store, this being a big discount retailer. And in those days, because everybody bought CDs and records and stuff, each one of these stores had to have a huge record department. And a huge record department means a huge quantity of physical stock in there. So they had tons of it in there. Well, all these stores, I guess Best Buy would be an example of a modern one. Anyway, so all these stores were like fighting each other and knocking each other out of business. And every time one of those stores went out of business, truckloads of out-of-date, shop-worn CDs and records are going back to the labels. And this ain't helping them at all. So around 1990-ish, the labels were starting to really hurt from this stuff, and they're trying to keep an eye out for some other areas they can get into that might be money makers. And somebody said, "Hey, wait, this gospel stuff, somebody just got a platinum record." What? So within a few months, I mean, literally probably 4, 5, 6 months, major labels had pretty much bought up every independent gospel label they could get their hands on, except Vicky Mac wouldn't sell. So she had the last that as far as I knew, of the real independent ones. And the result was that suddenly we had budgets. Instead of, 3 days, burn like a good, we had 3 weeks, and we had, so suddenly the gospel business turned into like the real record business. And we had spent the last few years of the 80s doing a lot of alternative rock, which we all personally liked a lot. But that's as fickle a market as anything. And all of a sudden in the early 90s, everybody wanted to go to Seattle. So it was really a good time for us to have a platinum record. And so through the middle 90s, I ended up doing a great deal of these records. When lightning strikes, people want to figure it's going to happen again. So, and I did my homework. I figured these things out. And working with Donald, we created some style, sonic style, sound styles that kind of helped define that stuff. And people would say, "Well, how do you get the drums like that?" And I didn't want to say, "I'm mixing them just like a rock record," but that's what I was doing. And And in my head, you know, when I'm working on the gospel tunes, in my head was like all my favorite R&B from the early 70s, you know, Love Train and that kind of stuff. I mean, I love that stuff. And so that's kind of where I was. Plus, I had all this rock experience and I'm working on drums like that. Anyway, so gospel market is a relatively conservative market artistically, perhaps with the exception of Donald. And consequently, a lot of people wanted records that sounded like those records. And so that led to me doing a great deal of that type of work, gospel records, really up into the, you know, middle 2010s, you know, 2016 when I closed my mix studio. So, and not always the same, but using a lot of the same elements I'd developed to make those ones in the 90s pop. So, and as, you know, I was, like I say, big old boisterous tunes, fabulous players and singers. I mean, what's not to like? But it wasn't all that I did. You know, I don't have a ministry that people have thought I had or something. No, but you know, they just hired me because I could deliver.